All right, let's kick it off. Welcome to another webinar. This one is near and dear to my heart because we're going to go over some of the ideas that I ran when I created Seven Factor, and also just we've been doing this for a while. I've seen a lot of companies do things a lot of different ways. But one thing that we have spent a lot of time with that I think is useful to discuss sort of in the broader sense is this idea of just-in-time process. If you're used to heavy, overweight, scaled, big company process, this might feel a little countercultural. I don't mean it to be rebellious, but what I do think is important is knowing when to apply process at the right time. Now, process broadly speaking, I'm not talking about your HR process. I'm not talking about your data retention process, your backup process, like things that are operationally more operations focused, that have to be there are things that just frankly could likely benefit from some of the ideas in this, but are more solid in that we have to do this. We have to have a SOC audit. We have to have a high trust audit. We need the following, backup and encryption strategies in place. Like those things are largely exempt, except for maybe a few specific ideas that we're going to talk about today. So, who am I? And my 9 year journey. My name's Jeremy. I started Seven Factor Software 9 years ago now, and we've grown and scaled. By the end of this year, we'll be at about 70 people. It's been a lot of fun, but it's also been a learning experience. I did not come from a uh, heavily business oriented background. I came from a small town in North Georgia and just sort of built this company as we've gone. And I think that we've learned a lot of very important things about how to manage the company, how to grow it. And I frankly think that this idea of just in time process is a thing that we have enjoyed greatly. It has made our company better. And I'd love to learn more, or I would love for you all to learn a little bit more about what that means. So, what is the definition of a just in time process? Only add process when it solves a demonstrated pain, right? We do want to allow some chaos in our system, and this can be a little bit counter to the way certain people think about managing teams, and we need to be careful about discussing that. But we want to balance chaos with bureaucracy. Obviously, the bureaucracy means everything requires sign off, and everything has sort of this large chain. There are certain organizations in certain places where that has to occur, but I still advocate deeply for removing as much as you can. Because bureaucracy and too much process dampens inertia in your organization by quite a bit. And there's a great book called The Phoenix Project that if you haven't read, I highly recommend that you read. It discusses this exact issue around bureaucracy and how a software engineering team can be very slow because folks don't allow them the freedom that are required. And again, it could be due to a lack of understanding. It could potentially even be a pathological culture, but we'll talk about the Western cultural typography here in a minute. But at the end of the day, the way Seven Factor views processes is we build a thing when we need it. And that's everywhere. That's not just in our engineering team. That's in the marketing team. That's in the sales team. That's everywhere. If we need something, we create it and we follow it. But we'll dig more into that here as we go. So, what is the problem with process? Again, if you're a process brained human, this may run counter to your culture. Startups typically thrive on speed, but as you grow, you add complexity, right? And that's when it makes sense to start thinking about process. I can think of a few times, and we'll go over it later in the presentation, that we as a company at Seven Factor decided that, okay, now's the time that we need to do something. Too little process is complete chaos. They're dropped balls. We're not thinking about outcomes because, again, you want just enough process that drives the team towards outcomes. And then too much process, again, is we have basically this gravitational pull around bureaucracy where we can't literally do anything because without filing 15 tickets, we don't really get our outcomes. And again, the trap is that more process equals more control, which tends towards better outcomes. That is not the case. That is a false equivalency, right? That does not ring true for many organizations. More process does mean more control, but it typically does not mean better outcomes. And sometimes that control doesn't actually produce the result that you're looking to produce in the organization, obviously. So let's talk real quick about Westrum's typology of organizational culture. This is a thing that came out, it's been out for a while, and the DevOps community was talking about this. I saw several during the early DevOps days. I would see a lot of presentations on this typology. I like the fact that psychology has creeped its way into software engineering, a very science-based approach, very logical. And now we have psychology, which is again science-based, but also logical, but in a different way. It's more of the science of people. And I like this sort of triangle of different types of cultures. We have the pathological culture, which is power oriented. This is not somewhere that you want to work. You have bureaucratic, which is rule oriented. I personally don't want to work in that. But there are some cases where that makes sense. And the downsides are that information is hard to find. You do process for process's sake, et cetera. And sometimes you can be in these. You can be bureaucratic without even really knowing it, and we'll talk about that in this presentation. I'm hoping that you'll kind of have an aha moment if you live inside some form of bureaucratic culture. And then finally, generative, which I love, performance oriented. This is my favorite. Information flows freely. We focus on outcomes. Teams work together for the sake of getting the job done, right? Tribes, not teams. We're executing because we have a job to do and we need to produce a result, and we're not just doing it because we were told to do it this way. I would argue that the just in time process idea only works well in generative cultures. Obviously, a bureaucratic culture is looking to have rules in place before we need them because we need those rules in place for the sake of having them. And then in a pathological culture, you're never going to do anything that doesn't sort of allow you to continue to push the iron fist. Which we won't talk very much about pathological cultures. I haven't really encountered any in my travels as a consultant. I've seen some pretty heavy bureaucratic cultures, but it's fairly rare for you to see pathological. Those organizations don't last very long. Generative, performance oriented, I haven't really seen many of those. I would argue seven factor is, of course, I'm being selfish there. But at the end, where you want to lean into how the culture sets the ceiling for how effective this process can be, right? And in a bureaucratic culture, it's difficult to truly get why we're doing the things we're doing. In a generative culture, again, you're throwing process away that doesn't make any sense, and you're leaning into this idea of just-in-time creation of processes that make sense. So I want to talk in this presentation about a couple of anti-patterns around process, and I've got five for you. There's obviously more, but I want to talk about five specific ones that I have seen. And most organizations don't fail because they lack process, but typically because they misuse it. I've seen all kinds of different anti-patterns and issues, but typically adding a process as a fix instead of solving the root causes is a trap I see. Seeing that more telemetry is refinement for certainty or clarity is oftentimes a mistake I've found, and we'll talk about that, about how, once a metric becomes a target, it ceases to become a good metric. Goodhart's law, right? Building rituals for optics rather than outcomes. This is also a sort of a flavor of the second bullet point, where all we care about is more of the optics and sort of the performance art of doing the process. I've seen this, and this may be a little bit controversial, but retros in Scrum are sometimes, at least the ones that I've been a part of in many different cases, have just simply been a ritual where we do it because we need to, and management wants us to get better, so we get together and we do smiley faces or frowny faces. And I mean, those can be very valuable, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're useless, but I have been in those retros where literally the engineering team is staring at each other and just saying, can we go get back to work? We know what's wrong, or we fixed what was wrong, so let's just continue. Again, process for process sake, process for optics, process because we said we needed to do it. Those are things I would resist, for sure. So what do these anti-patterns do? Again, friction, right? I want to talk about inertial dampening. I want to talk about gravity. It slows your ability to get things done. But one of the biggest things I want folks to take away from this presentation is it erodes accountability. And I'll talk about that in a second. So transition. Over the next slides, we're going to look at these five different anti-patterns and illustrate how process can go wrong. Yes, I'm going to read from my slides. One moment. I need water. All right. And if anyone has any questions, obviously, we can take those, drop them in the chat, and we'll get back to you. All right, anti-pattern number one, over planning. This is my least favorite anti-pattern, and this is the one I see a lot. If you're a Scrum person, you're not going to like me, and I'm now your enemy because I think that a lot of Scrum and Safe Agile is over planning. Now, again, executives, I get it. You have to have some form of line into when a thing is going to be done. There are other ways to do it, though. So let's take that off the table and say that we get that you have to plan. I understand planning. Let's assume that planning is a thing that needs to happen. But when we add additional layers of planning and telemetry just to fix our delivery pain, what I have seen is that you devolve into the Phoenix Project. Where all you're doing is trying to put more control in place to try and fix bottlenecks. You're putting more telemetry in place to try and solve for why we're not delivering against what we're trying to get out the door. The best example I have is Scrum devolving into waterfall because of all this heavy upfront planning. If you've ever been a part of a Scrum system, and again, I'm going to hate on Scrum a lot here, but I want everyone to know that's listening to this or watching this, I don't hate Scrum. It is a perfectly fine process if it is metered appropriately and managed correctly. Just like Kanban is a fine process when managed correctly. Just like I would argue probably waterfall is a fine process when managed correctly. But each of those individual processes have trade-offs that we have to understand. The trade-off of waterfall is we do all of our planning up front only to hand it to delivery and to ignore the fact that there are lots of problems that come out of delivery because delivery was not involved in the planning in typical situations. Scrum and sprint commitments are more or less many waterfall sessions, right? We're taking that giant planning up front and breaking it out into simple, tiny little Scrum plannings where we spend 8 hours in a room doing our Q1 planning, and then we come out and we do sprint planning, and that takes another 8 hours. And now we've lost all of this time where we could be moving forward and delivering against our commitments to plan things. Now, again, if that works for you, totally fair and fine. The anti pattern I want to call out is adding more process to fix a thing because we think that more process is the answer, right? Telemetry is a great example. Hitting sprint commits, break. One process I've seen that drives me crazy is, well, now because we weren't able to hit our sprint commitment, we now need to break every story into unit vector stories. What do I mean by unit vector story? Every story is exactly the same size. That is impossible. I've never done that, right? As a software engineer with over 2 decades of experience, I have never encountered a business domain where I can simply break tickets into exact unit vector sizes. There has to be some level of variability in that. I talk about if you have a pile of rocks, one rock's 5 pounds, one rock's 10 pounds, one rock's is 3 pounds. And the job is to get those rocks to the other side of the river. And that's more or less what you're doing when you're building software. You can break all the rocks into the same size in theory, but it never actually works out in practice, right? And that is adding more process because we missed a sprint commitment. Now we're asking our engineering team to take another 3 to 4 hours of cognitive load to try and break these things into smaller pieces. Another anti-pattern I've seen in this vein is where we simply push more detail into our tickets, where a ticket spells out every single thing that ever needs to be done. Now, there are valid reasons to call this out if you're in BDD or something where you have a QA team and that QA team needs to truly understand, old school QA team needs to truly understand what was done on this ticket. Sure, maybe that makes sense, but I favor collaboration over this anyway. I would argue you can get rid of any process that's designed to solve those problems and replace them with getting everyone into a room and deciding together how we're going to move forward and deciding together what the current set of issues that we need to solve for are. The net effect of this, again, more refinement does not equal more certainty. That we've proven that out over the past 10 years of Scrum being the one of the primary ways of delivering software. We know that more refinement does not mean more certainty unless you are cooking the books in some way. And again, I'm not judging. It is what it is, right? If that's what gets outcomes out the door and that works for you, then by all means do that. But I want to challenge people to think differently here. You're slowing down delivery, you're increasing friction, and you're putting everyone around this sort of centerpiece of the planning in the plan, and we have to do the plan, the plan, the plan, the plan. The best product teams that I work with don't care about the plan. It's a guideline, right? Pirate Codex. It's more like guidelines anyway. And I highly encourage folks to read the Phoenix Project. if you want to a little bit more insight into this. It's a great book. It talks about great things, and it's a wonderful. It paints the picture of what it means to have a system that is symptomatic of some of these issues. Number two, theater. I won't spend too much time on this one. Again, mistaking rituals for real collaboration. This one's pretty rare. I haven't seen it quite often. I do see it as a pathological trait, right? When you're looking more on appearances and control structures rather than thinking about outcomes. But a silly example I have is where stand-ups they drift into status reports instead of actual coordination. One of the things we like to do at Seven Factor is our stand-ups are mini planning sessions, where we don't talk about what I did today, what I did yesterday, what I'm doing today, and what are my blockers. That doesn't add a whole lot of value because it's simply a status report. If I wanted to get that from a developer, I could simply ask them, "Hey, what's going on today?" Right? Especially as engineering leadership, we prefer to bake collaboration into everything. So our stand-ups are literally having a conversation about this is the next ticket that needs to come up. Who can take it? Is anyone available to take this ticket? So it's a prioritization exercise, and it's also an execution exercise where we're all coordinating on how to solve certain problems. Um, Process signals activity without driving outcomes. Again, if you find yourself just doing a thing because you were told to do it and you don't believe in it, I would question that 100%. That's just true in life in general. If I'm doing something and I don't know why I'm doing it, I'm like, wait, why am I doing this? And that's what we believe in. Again, no shade if people think retros are a great thing. We've done retros occasionally, but for example, I think a retrospective is another example of just something we do to say that we did it and not that we do to actually improve. Because frankly, feedback is better delivered in the moment than it is delivered as a batch at the end of the sprint, right? So if I'm working with someone and I see that maybe their code is a little sideways, or maybe I don't like that they're checking in one giant PR with 5,000 commits to it. I'm going to tell them that now. I'm not going to wait until the end of the stand up during a retrospective and say something like, "Well, we need to have smaller check-ins," because it's too late. And plus, individuals tend to take feedback better in the moment anyway. So be very careful to question why you're doing something. Don't do it just because you've always done it that way. The next one, anti-pattern three, solving symptoms. This is the one that's the most insidious and it's the hardest to detect. We're addressing surface pain with just checkpoints. We're adding gate reviews. And typically we're doing this because either the team doesn't understand what they're doing or how to solve a problem, or we're lacking some form of capability. Or in the very worst case, leadership doesn't trust the team and they simply want more telemetry to measure them against. We're a fan of intent-based leadership at Seven Factor. What I mean by that is my team is expected to tell me what they're going to do to solve a problem. They're going to check in with me because I'm the captain of the ship and I can veto. I have veto power. But ultimately, I trust and hand ownership of execution to the people who are the smartest and best people to make those decisions on the ground, right? And the problem with this is we're again adding bloat and fluff to our system, just adding steps without solving for a real capability gap or a real accountability slash trust vector that you want in place with these teams. Typically, we see this in bureaucratic cultures, again, using process to avoid investing in real capability, or saying something like, well, the process will train people, and the process is what's going to produce the result. That is the biggest lie you can ever believe, that process produces outcomes. And I think that's the trap many people have fallen into in software development life cycles in 2026 and 2025, excuse me. Geez, time traveled there. Believing that the process is what's producing your outcomes is a lie. It's not. What's producing your outcomes is the people on the ground and the capabilities and the trust you've handed them, right? That's what gets you your business outcome. So thinking, and as leaders, we can get into this trap where you view humans as simply systems of equations. You view your team as a group of telemetry, as a set of velocity metrics, as I have 10 teams and 10 teams have 10 sprint commits, and those sprint commits are equal to that X with some standard deviation. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have systems level thinking when you're at the top, when you're a VP, when you're a director. It is quite important to have systems level thinking, but you should be thinking about the telemetry as more of a directional guidepost for you to implement changes in the relationships and the collaboration structures inside your teams, and not just saying, well, my team on average is delivering this, so that is the law and therefore the process is working. It's not. The success of the company is not your software development lifecycle. The success of your company is the outcome that you produce and how you're impacting the market. Number 4, process calcification. What is calcification? That is when something seizes up. The root problem here is that the process that solved yesterday's problems are permanent, and we shall never change them, for they are the sacred cow. Mandatory approvals or reports that no longer serve a purpose, they become untouchable sacred cows. It adds a bunch of clutter and it adds a bunch of gravity. It adds a bunch of friction that slows down delivery, right? Both bureaucratic and pathological cultures will resist pruning. We can't change it because it either indicates some control that we have in place or it introduces a perceived risk. Now, risk is another conversation we can have, because anytime you want to make a change to a process, obviously there's some tree of accountability, especially if you're a VP and you're reporting up to a CEO or a CXO or whatever. There is a tree of accountability that you have to manage risk to. Totally understand that. But this is one of the biggest problems I see with organizations that I work in, is we do it this way because that's how we've always done it, right? We are literally frozen in time. There are some compliance-oriented processes that you can't change, right? I get that. There's nothing we can do there. Although I do think there are times where you can be innovative and try and skirt around the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. But again, it depends on the industry that you're working in. But this one, I would argue, is the biggest killer and the biggest resistance to moving into a more generative and performance oriented culture where you trust your teams to get things done. And by the way, I can't spell process. Nice. Just saw that. So this one you have to root out and find and destroy quickly. And we'll talk about how we did this at 7Factor, but you must make sure that you are avoiding freezing your processes in time and never revisiting them, because that is what will turn you into a bureaucratic culture. We're doing the things just because we've always done them that way. Anti-pattern number 5, which I think is the most important that we have to understand. Process does not equal accountability. People get this, they think that's true. And if you think about it for 10 seconds, it kind of does make sense. Oh, yeah, I mean, the process is going to show me when people don't do what they're supposed to do, and that is going to yield accountability. Yes, but think more deeply, right? Compliance does not equal ownership, right? If I put a process in place and force you to do it, you're just going to do it because you were told to. So if I'm doing whatever you told me to do, I don't own it. I don't care. I'm just doing what you told me to do. You're removing one of the key components of a human being, which is the creativity and the ability to own and run and charge forward and get my ideas out there and use my ideas to solve problems, because every human being is a creative being that wants to solve a problem. And just because one person solves it slightly different than I would solve it doesn't mean that it's wrong. I talk about this in code all the time. One person writes a function, I write a function. They may look a little different, but you know what? They both solve the business problem. Mine may be a little bit smaller than yours, but ultimately there's still good code, right? Again, assuming that they are good code and that we're not writing garbage. Failures in this case are blamed on the system rather than on team behaviors. I want to say that again because it's incredibly important. When you use process for accountability, don't get upset when your employees point to your company and say the company's the problem, right? Don't get upset when you get flame wars in private surveys that talk about how terrible the company is, because you've created the system that they're looking towards and resisting. Humans like to resist things, right? Think about The Matrix. It's a great movie, right? We're talking about, I hate the system. I want to attack the system. The system is oppressive. So when you create a process-driven accountability framework, you should expect people to blame the framework and the system and start blaming the company instead of looking inward and trying to sort it out. Now, again, There are obvious exceptions to this rule where people will blame the system no matter what. But let's assume you have a good relationship with an employee and you want that person to succeed in your system and you want to give them a reason to get up and execute every day like we do here at Seven Factor, right? We're the operating system for our people. Accountability goes toward process, not teams, right? When you look at process being the accountability predictor, it erodes responsibility, gets rid of all your feedback loops because again, people don't care. The process is holding them accountable. They're not being inspired to go do their best work. Pathological and bureaucratic cultures project blame outward. Generative cultures drive ownership inward and prioritize outcomes. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But this one is hard to really wrap your head around because there are obvious gray areas here where a process makes sense. And, HR, for example, HR processes obviously are designed to hold people accountable. There are plenty of examples I'm sure we can think of that are out of the box here or that are exceptions to the rule. But I'm talking about delivery. I'm talking about execution on the ground. Your marketing team, your software development team, your data team. Like folks need to be inspired to go get things done and be given the courage to go and do that, and not just simply being held accountable to a process that was built by a bureaucrat in a dark room. So here are the summaries, right? Go over them again. 5 really common issues we want to avoid. Number 1, over planning is a process. Process in your planning that produces over planning. Geez, heavy refinement. Again, just trying to optimize on metrics, things like that. Process is theater, rituals for simple optics. This doesn't work. It just produces genuine time wasting. Solving for symptoms and not systems, approvals instead of capability, process calcification, yesterday's fixes linger, and then mistaking process for accountability. Blame the system, not the team. And they all 5 share the exact same flaw, right? Process is used as a substitute for solving real problems or driving true accountability. Now, with that being said, let's talk about how we as a company have chosen to run in a just-in-time way. And I have a couple of examples here. So when I started the business, 9 years ago, I was running a team of. I just hired my first couple of employees, and I wanted to replicate the stand-up idea, but I wanted to do it in a way that I felt added more value. Or retro, excuse me, not stand-up. I wanted to replicate the retrospective idea and figure out how to do it with more value. So I created this thing called a health check, and there's a channel in our Slack that goes back to 2018, and it's actually a lot of fun to go all the way back and look at the original health checks. And initially, it started out as a template that I asked my engineers, okay, so at the end of the week on Friday, I want you to fill this out. And I want you to tell me what your morale is. I want you to tell me what you think the client's morale is. And I want you to write up how you did on the week. So it was not just a way for me to understand what my teams were doing, because I was trying to scale to about 18 people by 2019. But it was a way for me to understand the heads of my developers, where they're at, how they're thinking about things, how they think the client perceives the project. And then I would check in with the customers as well to figure out what they thought and check in. And I would compare the two to really understand, does this developer, this person, this consultant understand what's going on? Do they have situational awareness, which is a very difficult thing for consultants to gain, but it's incredibly important to have situational awareness, right? Is the team doing well? Do we think that this project is doing well, or do we think we're kind of running into some challenges here? So as the company continued to grow, we changed this process maybe twice. This is an example of a process that I put in place once, and I didn't really move. I didn't undo the process, but I certainly changed it. A couple of years later, when I was bigger, I was 25, 30 people, we had some folks that built a forum in Slack, and we changed it away from just sort of arbitrary opinions into NPS scores. I didn't know what an NPS score was in 2018. I had no clue. So after learning about NPS scores and learning about other important things to take into account, like project health on a traffic light. Originally, it was on a scale 1 to 10, but we decided that doesn't make any sense. Let's do red, yellow, green, because it's easier for us to look at that and understand what's the difference between a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10 on project health and a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, or excuse me, a 6 and a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10 in project health. It doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it was too broad, right? The spectrum was too broad, and it didn't provide any value whatsoever, that fidelity, that level of fidelity. So we went to a traffic light. We changed it to that. And now recently we actually we added things like shout outs, where individual engineers can shout people out and give them kudos on the health check to say this person crushed it this week. So we've taken this process and we've iterated on it. We like it. We love it. We think it's really great. It's simple, it's durable, it continues to deliver value, but you can guarantee that we check in on this. Every year we talk about it. We figure out, is this still the thing we want to do? Are we still reading this? My director of employee experience goes through and looks at morale. Morale has always been there since the beginning. Morale on a scale of 1 to 10. So my developers tell us how they're feeling, and we honestly look at those things. And I get a report where Alyssa tells me, here are the engineers with low morale. And I'm like, great, let's lean into our engineering managers and have a conversation with them to try and make sure these folks are good and are okay and that we're serving them properly. So this hasn't changed much, but it's been something we've iterated on, and it's produced a really great result in our company. So hiring is an example of one that has changed dramatically. When we started, it was myself literally having conversations with people. I did every single interview. I didn't really do any sort of deep coding challenges. So I count myself extraordinarily lucky to get the people that I got early on. And as we begin to scale in 2020, we found that we actually needed a little bit better of a process. So at this point, we had made the change in our career framework that we had distinguished engineers and principal engineers, or didn't have PEs at the time. We had distinguished engineers and staff engineers. So the team went off and due to some really amazing contributors, developed our interview process and made it even better from when it was just me. I'm still on the last round interviews because I like to meet people, but I no longer have to do all the interviews, and we've developed and built a very clean process that has, in fact, it's changed a few times as well, but it's not been sort of deeply gutted. The big difference here is that as we scaled, we recognized quickly that the core framework of our interview process is fine. It doesn't need to change, but how we staff that needs to be drastically modified, because originally it was 2 or 3 people doing all the interview work. And as we scaled, it made sense to bring our staff engineers and some of our SWE 3s in, and then we created a more distributed framework as we went. We didn't start with a 15-step 6-person panel interview because I would have to clone myself 5 times in order to do that. We used gut feel at the beginning, but as we walked towards scaling, we added a whole lot more process. But that process is always questioned. We even had a conversation 2 weeks ago about our hiring process, if we need to change it. Are there things that we don't like about it? So we're always looking at this. We're never settling for best, just like good software, right? We're always refactoring. Bookkeeping is an example of another one that changed a lot that we implemented. And the reason I bring this one up is a lot of folks think that, well, it's your accounting system, it has to be right the first time for auditing and tax purposes, but in fact, it does not. When I started the business, the goal was to make more money than I spend. I know I'm like a Wharton Business School graduate at this point, right? It evolved into, after a couple of years, we started looking at COGS margins per project. Did I know what COGS margins were when I started the company? Yes, I came from Slalom. I understand the economics of a consulting firm, but I didn't care because the goal was to grow a business. The goal was, I need to make revenue. I need to sell deals. And I was selling deals where I felt like at a level that I felt could sustain us, right? I remember talking on every town hall and saying something to the effect of, I just need to make sure we're all paid for. Because the talent and the seed of the crew that we have, which most people have been here over 4 years at this point, that was what I was after, is building this engine of great human beings that we can then turn into a profitable business so that we all prosper, right? After COGS margins per project, now recently, the past 3 years, we have completely professionalized books. We have budgets, cost centers, revenue centers, We're reporting out a lot of very sophisticated metrics. Now, again, I don't have like 10-year forecasting models or anything like that because frankly, I don't want to do that. Maybe one day I will, but a business our size doesn't really need to be forecasted out any farther than 1 quarter, frankly. I asked my sales team, I just need to know what we're making next quarter. Like, and here are your targets, right? We don't have go gets. We don't have P&L targets or things that I'm holding the sales team to yet, because we're doing a fantastic job farming the network that we have and growing the business that we have. Now, again, we'll move that forward as we get bigger, as we're approaching 70 people, as we get on up to the 100 people. Yeah, we're absolutely going to start talking about pipeline and go get and things like that, because it makes sense at that point and at that size to worry about those things. But right now, it's not a thing we need. So why worry about it, right? Why sit here in front of my monitor and spend hours doing forecasting models when, frankly, my time is better spent going and talking to clients and selling deals and getting us online and getting us running, because the business is running, right? So that's an example of don't over process it. I could easily over process this. I could hire a CFO. I know really great ones, and I'm sure they would do phenomenal jobs of helping us understand some of the deeper things that we need to know about our forecasting. But right now, we don't need it. We might in a while, but we don't need it right now. And that's a good example, right? Bookkeeping is one of those that it can be tricky because it's important to get it right, but it's also not something that you don't have to overspend there. You can just take it as you come. And then finally, I won't go into the entire story because it's quite a deep one, but our career framework, this demonstrates the importance of iterating thoughtfully, right? Because one of the ideas in our career framework that when we set out to build this 2 years ago, and Alan Brooks, who's no longer with us, he's doing product stuff now. Great dude. He was the one that I credit for the genesis of our career framework. He was the guy that I set to. We need something so that when people join us, they have inertia. They can move forward in our company, right? And a lot of career frameworks are viewed as toll gates. They're viewed as, what's the best word? Blockers, gatekeepers, right? So I wanted to try and flip that. I wanted to say, look, I want my career framework to be about inertia. Now, again, if someone gets told no, if they declare for promotion and then told no, then yes, that's a feels bad. I don't like that. Nobody likes that. So the conversation over the past 2 years, we've taken a ton of feedback from our folks. We've taken a ton of conversations internally through leadership with our engineering managers, all of whom are very dedicated to the success of our humans. And we have had endless conversations about what is the best way to approach this. And I still don't think we have it right, but I think we have it at least 85% right at this point. But we still have a lot of work to do, right? I'm not going to sit on my heels and say, this thing that we spent all this time putting in place is the golden calf, and that is exactly what's going to help people grow. We added we added principal engineers this year, or maybe late last year, this year. When I pitched the SWE 1, SWE 2, SWE 3 distinguished engineer, we had mentioned PEs as being a possibility, but we didn't do it at that time. We didn't add them 2 years ago when we created the distinguished engineer and the new engineering manager and the way people work today. When we created that 2 or 3 years ago, we mentioned it, but we didn't do it because it made no sense until recently, when we decided that, you know what, some people just want to continue up that technical track. So let's iterate, let's add it, let's create it. And some people get afraid because they're afraid of the change management that comes with big decisions, right? They're afraid of spending political capital with their humans and 50% of their workforce being angry. Again, I'll be the first to tell you that you're going to get 90%. And on a good day, hopefully you're getting 90% of the folks that work in your company on board and aligned with what you're doing. There's 10% that will never be happy, but that's okay. Their opinions are incredibly important, and their opinions matter, because that 10% that's not happy could impact the rest of the 90% to be even more happy and get them into the happy column by listening to their ideas. So we work really hard to ask for ideas all up and down this tier, right? And the career framework was a great example of something that took us a long time to get right, but we're still iterating on. Nothing in there is sacred. And this is frankly how people grow here. So it's a very important component of the company itself. So all that to say, what is sort of the crux of this? You need to refactor your processes, just like software, right? Your process is going to accumulate technical debt, process debt over time. If you find yourself in a situation where everything is complex, it's very slow to get anything done, you have outdated assumptions, then I would argue red green refactor, right? Let's look at and test our assumptions. Let's have conversations with our associates, our folks, our team members, conversations with leadership to get their ideas. Lean into intent, lean into saying, lean into placing accountability in the teams and pushing outcomes towards the teams instead of layering telemetry over the top. Again, the way we do that in Agile is we use predictive forecasting, where we simply look at past performance and use that to predict the future. I don't even ask my engineers to estimate things because they don't have to. They just need to do work. And then the system will sort out the estimates over time using statistical analysis, right? Science. It's great. And ensure that your process still solves today's problems and not yesterday's. And sometimes you need to just do a big sweep of everything and say, hey, what do we have? What are we doing? And we do this during our leadership syncs. We have a Q1 leadership sync, and then we all meet at the end of the year to discuss how we did for the year. And that's always where we're looking, okay, what did we do that made sense? What do we need to change in our partnership program? What do we need to change in our SDLC? What do we need to change in our HR, right? Not even HR is sacred in my organization. Everything is free game to be changed. And that ideology and mentality keeps a generative culture moving forward, and it keeps the best ideas percolating up to the top and hopefully implemented, right? So here's sort of the core idea. Don't invent process preemptively. Just in time that thing, right? Introduce the process when the pain point clearly signals the need. Now, there are obvious exceptions to the rule before someone flames me on the internet. And by the way, I don't care. But try hard to avoid doing process for the sake of it, right? I like to add process when the same mistakes repeat and we don't learn from them. I like to add process when onboarding new people feels chaotic. I like to add process when you have a client trust issue or we feel like it's very critical to our business. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I use that process for the rest of my life, right? We've put temporary things in place, like temporary forecasting rules, where I'll ask Sarah to come up with some things, or temporary, project margin rules. Like I'll ask the team, hey, I need this. And yeah, that can be irritating if you're the recipient of that work because it's interrupting, right? And it's like, I had my job, but frankly, the best organizations don't mind being interrupted. That's a lie that I think people have been told, is you shouldn't be interrupted. Interruptions are fine so long as they're appropriately prioritized and gated, right? Even as a software engineer, if you're in the middle of writing a ticket and you get interrupted and it's a very important ticket, then that means you probably need to work on that other thing instead. Now, obviously, again, there are exceptions to this rule. For being interrupted every 5 minutes, that's ridiculous. And leaders need to be held accountable to their interruptibility, right? I only spend that political capital when I think I really need it because I don't want to make people mad. I don't want to frustrate Sarah. I don't want to frustrate Alyssa. I don't want to frustrate my teams. But at the same time, if I really need something, I need to be able to come in and interrupt to solve that problem. And then finally, if money or compliance exposure is real, absolutely process that, right? High trust, HIPAA, there are plenty, DOD, there's lots of reasons that you need to have a process in place. But I would also argue you should think about if that process actually makes sense. So how do you add it? Number one, spot the constraint or the failure point. Where is the work falling down? Number two, my favorite thing, design the lightest possible process. If anyone knows me, I'm a fan of Occam's razor. What is Occam's razor? The simplest answer is probably the right answer. If you're over engineering and overcomplicating something, you need to back off and calm down, because it's possible that the lightest possible process is going to be the best, and then add complexity as you find that you need it, right? If you're like, wait, that missed a bunch of ed case. Okay, let's add more to that. Let's add more process. Pilot and adapt. Try it with a team, try it with a small group, then adjust it, and then embed or retire. If it delivers value, keep it. If it doesn't, prune it. We have a saying at 7Factor: if it sucks, we stop doing it. I say this on every town hall or every other town hall. If we find something that is just not adding any value, we don't do it anymore. And the team has the appropriate leeway to say that to leadership, to speak truth to power and say, this is dumb. Why are we doing this? Okay, cool. Prove it to me, right? I'm not just going to take your word for it. You need to have a good case. And sometimes process is a little painful, and sometimes we have to deal with pain. But ultimately, if it doesn't make sense, we will prune that. We will not do that anymore. Process should always increase clarity and outcomes, and not just add overhead. So resist the need to add it. Let's bring it home. Growth requires balance. Too little process creates chaos. Too much creates bureaucracy. We love just-in-time process. You add the right structure at the right time to solve the problem at hand, and then you iterate on that. So what do I think you should do? Audit your processes. Figure out what's calcified or performative and prune them, right? Get rid of things that make no sense and do the appropriate change management with your teams, right? Because you'll also buy some organizational trust when you're getting rid of things that people hate. Invest in your culture, shift towards a generative environment where accountability lives with teams and not systems. Stop thinking that your system is what's delivering your outcomes. Think that your people are what's delivering your outcomes, and adjust your process to suit the people in your team. One team's process might not match another team's process. I go that crazy, which, some people don't like that because it's a lot to manage. We're still small, so it's not a big of a problem for us. As we grow, it may become an issue, and I may change my mind, right? Just in time process. But right now, it makes sense for us to be okay with two different clients and teams running two different processes. That's totally fine with us. Refactor regular. Treat processes like code. Simplify, streamline, evolve, modify, rename, refactor, put it in a pattern, change it, and then anchor in outcomes, right? Every process has to tie to a value delivered and results and not metrics. That's different, right? If your process is designed to get you 20 sprint points, that's not what we should think about. Your process should be designed to getting software into the market that can drive ARR. That's a huge difference between just hitting 20 sprint points, right? So my final thought. I think the highest leverage thing you can do is to build a culture and conditions where teams can hold themselves accountable and your process serves your outcome, not the other way around. That's hard to do. It requires a specific level of trust with folks on the ground, with your senior leadership team. There are lots of things, and it's a ton of work. Trust me, I put in a lot of work in the past 9 years to win the trust of folks, and I'm sure I don't have everybody's, right? But this is a key differentiator between teams that are performative and teams that simply do things for the sake of doing them, is that they hold themselves accountable because they know the process is just there to serve their outcome, and it's not there to gate them, toll gate them, stop them from doing things, and to push them into a position to where they feel gate kept and they can't get anything done. That's it. This is one of my favorite topics. I love talking about it. I think, frankly, we've done a pretty good job at this. Are we perfect? No. Will we have plenty of issues in the future? Yes. Will we continue to iterate on our processes? Absolutely. As long as I'm in the leadership, the captain seat of this company, we will continue to do this. But hopefully this makes sense. And again, if you have any questions, concerns, just shoot us over a note. I'd love to hear more from you. If you disagreed with me, I'd love to hear that too. I'm very thoughtful about these things. I can think of 100 different ways to disagree with me. But I do believe in this because we've done it and we've executed on it. And I intend fully, as we continue to grow as a company, to keep this ideology core to who we are as a culture because it works. I think that's it.